how long, from your perspective, do we have before we start seriously losing my daughter's generation, future generations to come? At Notre Dame University, we have a general consensus of predominant Catholics, but even there, our students are having serious reservations. Will the leadership under Pope Francis be capable, are they willing to make a change, or are they even capable of making the changes that he represents as our poster child? Okay, do they have the cultural ability to make the change necessary? Because now we feel a sense of urgency. No longer do we have 200 years for change. My children are saying, I want it now. And I don't feel the sense of urgency in the Catholic Church leadership. I mean, I feel the Pope feels maybe this sense, but better the Pope. Where is that sense of urgency? Is it there?
Okay. I take it your children are in college?
Yes.
Okay. Well, I don't know how long we have. I don't like to think of it as a ticking time bomb. It makes me very nervous. I suffer from anxiety. I don't know about the leadership of the church and what can happen there. But I think that moving forward, the key is going to be not relying there. That's never how the church has really changed, in my understanding of it, and there are people here who know more than I do about the history of the church. But the church rarely changes from the top down, right? It bubbles up. And that's where the enthusiasm that Francis is stoking works. It's when the 20-year-olds know Francis's name. There was a time in my contemporary Catholicism class, and in Vatican II, I teach that too, where I would ask them the Pope's name, and they didn't know who Benedict XVI was. And they didn't know who the bishop was. And these were, Irish kids from Westchester County, right? That grown up, Italian kids from Jersey. Now we know, right? So again, it's not going to happen in YouTube time or Twitter time or whatever we want to call it, since we're old and they're not, right? Snapchat time. I don't think it's going to happen like this. But I think that as long as you're getting this enthusiastic participation, right? If you can get, students have always bought into the social message, right? Students have always gone on service trips, even the ones who don't go to church. So why can't we sort of focus on that and then empower them? Right? And this is something that we can do at a local level. Empower students to have liturgies and prayer services and feel like the church is theirs. And then that will, I think, bubble up. And that's more of a source of hope for me than waiting for the bishop to pick someone to do.
Relevance was mentioned, the relevance of the church. Now, I know in my parish, there are a lot of people who are doing things involved with social justice ministries that no one in the church knows about. Now, how do we, and I think storytelling is very important with regard to this. How do we get those stories out about people within our parish who are doing relevant things with regard to social justice? The only place that we get the church together is once a week on Saturday evening or Sunday.
Well, I think your experience is repeated in many places around the country. That is to say, this is sort of the bubbling up from the bottom, if you will. People who have heard the gospel, have heard maybe the social teaching, look for possibilities and go and find their way. The question about how we get the word out is complicated, I think, precisely because there are so many words around us today. In other words, if you think about a politician trying to capture some space and make known what he or she believes is the reason they should get elected. Very, very difficult to do that. And so when you think about a group of citizens who are Catholics who are doing things, I think there are different dimensions. I'm not positive that it all has to be known. I mean, the fact that it's being done is more important than other things, except that, to use a politician who was pretty successful, Mayor Benino in Boston once said, if you're doing something and no one knows anything about it, you're not doing it. Now, I think that's too extreme. That's because, well, he got elected 5 times, so what can you do? But that's what he used to tell his staff. If we're doing something and no one knows we're doing it, we're not doing it. I don't think that's true for what you're talking about. But I think, so some of it, I would say, may never need to be known to be successful, effective, and important. Secondly, it's interesting to look back in Catholicism to the period before the Council, because the Council is such a mountain. One of the things, particularly in Midwest Catholicism, was there were lots of organizations that joined people across lines and throughout a diocese. I mean, when you grew up in Boston, you always heard about the church in Chicago. You heard about the Catholic family movement in Chicago. You heard about Monsignor Hillenbrand and social justice. That all sort of disappeared for the most part after the Council. Everybody put their hope in this one thing that was so momentous that it would solve problems, and those kinds of organizations kind of collapsed. Today, in secular political science, one of the most important things that we talk about in building a society is in terms of social capital. That is to say, people doing things. My colleague is Bob Putnam, who wrote Bowling Alone, in which he worried about the fact that some of the same thing was happening in the society. Groups were falling apart and people were more individual. So I mean, I've always felt that we left some things behind after Vatican II that need to be recreated in a post-Vatican II church. And that kind of linkage across lines, whether it's strengthening the life of the family, addressing immigration, addressing social justice, addressing war and peace. Some of that gets you out beyond the specific parish into trans-parish and diocesan level and in secular society, into cities, states, and regions. I think those kinds of groups are another way to bring like-minded people together. There's some new groups that gather that way around specific things, but I think it would be good to look back at our history and try to recreate it in a different setting.
Hi, my question pertains to immigration. In our Catholic global perspective course taught by Dr. Donnelly, we're talking about the DREAM Act and how only a few states are enacting it, but not Congress as a whole. So my question is, can the vision of a world church and Pope Francis have an impact on the views and perceptions Congress have on immigration in the DREAM Act?
Well, I think my sense is that the picture on immigration is neither all light or all darkness in terms of its ability to move someplace. It is a sign of the sclerosis of the American political system that you cannot move a comprehensive immigration bill through the United States Congress. It just is one more sign of a sclerotic political system. And I don't say that as an outside critic. I say that as a citizen that's worried about the country. Secondly, however, because the sclerosis prevents getting done what needs to be done, a public policy that is comprehensive and that addresses a problem effectively, that does not mean that people's minds haven't changed. There is, if you look around the immigration debate today, my understanding is there's much more support in the general public than there is in the House of Representatives for it. Secondly, if you look at corporate leaders today, men and women who are the CEOs who drive the trillion-dollar economy that we have, they are not on the other side of the immigration debate from making progress on immigration. Now, this is not usually the leading edge of the left. That's just a corporate culture. But the fact of the matter is that I would take corporate culture today over the House of Representatives if I was going to try and move this forward. Thirdly, the church's connection to this issue is both natural and urgent to press ahead. The Catholic Church in the United States without immigration is not the Catholic Church. In other words, immigration has been part of the fabric of our life since the middle of the 19th century. And therefore, while we are not in the same place as a country as you were in 1850 or even in 1920, the fact of the matter is that the Catholic Church, by history, is connected to immigration, by doctrine is committed to what the Pope calls a generous, welcoming posture. And thirdly, my guess is that what Bob Putnam told me one day in the corridors of Harvard Kennedy School, because he's moved from Bowling Alone and American Grace, which is his study of the religious community in the United States. He just stopped me one day and he said, Bryan, he's now working on immigration. He said, there is no more important institution in this country on immigration than the Catholic Church. Now, Bob Putnam has his relationship to the Catholic Church, to say it's minimal is to overstate the case. Bob was a Lutheran who became Jewish. So he is not running to the RCIA program. But there's nobody better than Bob Putnam in crunching the numbers on a political problem. And he said there is no more important institution in the country on this question. So the sclerotic political paralysis opens up space for other voices to come up of necessity. We need to be sure that we're in the right place on it.
I'd like to thank both of our speakers for sharing your insights and the witness of your lives. I recently heard about a priest who said to his congregation, "Oh yes, Catholics are falling head over heels over Pope Francis. If you think you like Pope Francis," he said, "you're going to love Jesus." And encountering Jesus in the gospel, one of his best examples is how he loved and respected women.
I agree.
You got 2 votes for that.
I just want to thank you both for coming here today.
Where is it?
The mics are very small.
Regarding the talk that Pope Francis gave in Davos, what are your feelings on what he wants to do with the support of the poor, and do you think he did enough in his talk?
Well, I don't think he went to Davos. He must have sent a message to Davos.
Yeah.
And to be honest, I didn't see the message he sent to Davos. I can imagine it, but I didn't see it. So, I mean, I think he's very interesting. He has these broad, sweeping cuts at the state of the market, the financial regulations, the inequality in the globe. And then he sort of stabilizes things. He says, I am not a rabid, he didn't use rabid. He said, I'm not a populist. He said, I'm not out with unruly activism. He called it another one. So he is a Latin American bishop. And therefore, for example, if you take globalization as a phenomenon, okay, if you take globalization as a phenomenon, what is globalization? Well, if you take its cheerleader, Tom Friedman, in the New York Times, it's integration further, farther, faster. That's what it is. Now, but that means that's what it is economically. And John Paul II basically took what I would call a kind of measured view on globalization. He said globalization is not a fact of nature. That is to say, something that can't be controlled. It's also, he he didn't say this, but I'm not quoting. It's also not intrinsically evil. It is a process. And he said, first of all, it's an economic process that needs also to be a political process. That means the political measures should set some framework around it. And it's also a cultural process which, as we heard, is supposed to leave people's culture in place even as they change its capacity for economic development. So basically what he said about globalization is, as I read it, globalization has its own logic. It does not have its own ethic. That is to say, the logic of globalization is integration, further, faster, farther. But that process of integration shouldn't be treated like a force of nature, just let it go. That process, powerful as it is, which has demonstrated an extraordinary ability to create aggregate wealth, but not an extraordinary ability to deal with the question of distributional effect or equal participation. So what John Paul II, I think, was saying is, since it doesn't have its own ethic, we ought to put an ethic around it. Now, how do you do that? Well, it's the way you think about technology. Technology has its own logic, but not its own ethic. You cross the next stream, you cross the next mountain, you cross the next frontier, but then you have to start asking questions. For what purpose are you advancing this technology? By what means are you examining this technology? What are the consequences, good and bad, of this technology? Who are the actors who drive it? So then you build a framework around it. Now, as I say, I describe that as a sort of a neutral view. He takes it as a fact, could be dangerous, could be helpful, he tries to guide it. A Latin American bishop is more suspect of the process. Now that doesn't mean he has to say in classical Catholic language that globalization is intrinsically evil. He hasn't said it. But he's more suspicious of it. He knows it's harder to set a framework around that process. And therefore I think there'll be just a tilt of that in his approach to it, which may still mean that he will continue John Paul II of let's build a framework and let's build a political process to control it. But he will be, the presumption that you have to work hard to tilt this is stronger in him than I think it was in John Paul II.
If I can just say something too, I know this is a conference about Pope Francis, but I think one of the things that we would do well to do is to try to, and I need to do this myself since I just gave a 45-minute lecture on Pope Francis, to try to stop expecting that the Pope should be the one to do these things. Right? Maybe it's enough for the Pope to say, I don't like this, or this isn't all that great, and then not say anything else. And let economists, sort of open up the space for it and let other people fill in the blanks. That can happen ecclesially too, right? Maybe the Pope doesn't have to decide, and maybe Rome doesn't have to decide all of the translations. But like maybe we can just open up the space and let other people take over and let it battle out, in governments and in academies and things like that. I think growing up with a pontificate like John Paul II's, you grew accustomed to the Pope doing everything. And not all of the popes have to do all of the things. Other people can do the things.
I have a question over here. Thank you both for taking my question. We see a lot of images of the Pope in the media. And it's very much that, they're curious every day as to what he has new to say. Are there any potential areas for conflict between the Pope's message and the way the media represents it?
Yes, there is, because the Pope has a kind of, it seems to be a multi-dimensional impact, and therefore you have to look at each level of the impact he has. I mean, we've spent a lot of time talking about his impact on Catholicism, and that's a pretty large thing. That's 1 billion people out of 7 billion in the world. all over the world, so that's why it's a very important thing. The impact on Catholics has the ability to raise hopes, to reignite faith, to reconnect people to the church, or at least to open up a door by which they can look at the church again after it. So all of that is there. There's a whole other level that he impacts, let me call it public figures. I teach at a public policy school. So, you know, I've been at Harvard a long time. I am not used to faculty stopping me in the hall saying, did you hear what the Pope said? This is not the leading edge of Harvard culture. But that happens. That happens. Now, the people who say that, have a real but limited space of attention to the papacy. You know, they know it's different. They know he's different than anything they ever assumed. Much of what they thought of Catholicism might have been assumed rather than deep study of it, but they know it's different. So it is important to impact those folks, because those folks make a lot of difference in terms of the way policy is thought about, in the way which issues that are impactful. That's a different level than the way it impacts Catholics. The media is a culture unto itself, And, I mean, frankly, the meeting I was at yesterday afternoon was just to process how many invitations Cardinal O'Malley has to speak to the media. I mean, it is just, now he's Cardinal O'Malley, he's not Francis, but he's one of the 8 and all of that. It is just unbelievable. I mean, I've been in this business 50 years almost, and in the public role of the church since 1973. Never saw anything like it. But most of those folks are going to have an angle of vision that is not very close to most of what we talked about today. And in addition to maybe being like my friends who pass me in the corridor and say, it's really interesting that you've got this Pope, what they've got is, how do we emphasize the degree of conflict that he's either going to generate or not generate? How do we measure him instantaneously, not 5 years legacy? How do we measure him where he is today? And where they really want to go, and this is a hard question the church has to think about, because I don't think we answer it well. So I watched one interview yesterday with a couple of bishops on the first year of Francis. And so where they really want to go is to say he's done this, 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 and this. He's set up this commission, he has done this. When is doctrine going to change? And that's the key question. That's the fault line. Because the argument is, you can set up all those commissions, but then the doctrine remains the same. So if he really wants to change all of those things, he's going to have to change doctrine. Now that, to explain that problem, you know, is worth a semester. What's doctrine? You know, so in Catholicism, we talk about a hierarchy of truth. That there's the Trinity, and then there's the Knights of Columbus. Okay, both of them are part of Catholic. There's some difference. Nothing wrong with the Knights. So then of course, but you see, as soon as a bishop would open up and start talking about levels of doctrine, that's more than the media can handle. So then the headline that comes out is Bishop so-and-so says the Pope's going to change the doctrine because they're not all of equal weight. So my sense is you have to understand your audience in order to understand what they bring to the question and then how it's going to. So this is a big task we have. I mean, to have a Pope this visible is a big task because there is an interpretive task as well as the person himself.
Yeah, I think there's 2 things happening here. Number one is the way the media has changed. right? So every morning I wake up, I heard the song, and I go to Twitter, and I have 6 tweets from Religious News Service, or Catholic News Service, or David Gibson, or Commonweal. And this is what the Pope said this morning, and this is the analysis of what the Pope said this morning, and this is this person's take on what the Pope said this morning. Every single day. We're expecting this sort of ubiquity of message, right? You know, everything is it's not all on Facebook, but it's all Facebook time, right? Whatever the Pope is doing, someone needs to know about it and broadcast it. We don't need to know this much. Right? We know too much. Right? The Pope went here, the Pope looked this way, the Pope wore this is the color of the ring today. You know, there's this avalanche of information coming at us. And at the same time, the media crafts the discussion that the media wants to have about Catholicism. Right? It's not, we are not, except in a consuming role, participating in the way that Catholicism is portrayed in the media. And increasingly in this country, the media is fractured, right, and polemical. And so there's, you know, when is the Pope going to change something? And what do the people on the right think about this? And what do the people on the left think about this? Well, not everybody falls into those categories, but that's the way that, I think of it like I'm sorry to keep using children metaphors, but you know when you give a kid a shape sorter, right? And there's like a square one, and a circle one, and a star one, but then inevitably the child has other blocks that don't fit in. Right? Talk about toddlerhood, and then you have to have 18 tantrums about trying to get something in, and it doesn't work, and you throw it. This is what's happening, right? We have boxes for Catholicism, and they are abortion, gays, women priests, right? And the Pope as Superman. And everything else that the Church does, which is pluriform, varied, and extensive, it just sort of gets thrown to the side, right? It doesn't fit in the little boxes that we've created for Catholicism, or the way Catholicism is covered. Those of us who are around this all of the time know this, of course. You all know that the Church does more than that, and that might not even be the most important thing that the Church is working on, right? Or what occupies the majority of the time. But it's a combination of this need to be constantly reporting, and at the same time, this curtailed vision of what is allowed to be a Catholic issue in the media. So I do think that there's a lot of his message that we don't hear, or at least that doesn't get repeated and repeated and repeated and retweeted and retweeted and retweeted. And so that's why it's incumbent upon us, just as the media has accelerated, our consumption of the media has to become more sophisticated, right? The technology doesn't come with the ethics. We have to provide a structure for how we consume it. Right? And maybe I need to not read 18 tweets about what the Pope said first thing in the morning, because then I start every morning thinking about, oh my gosh, how is this going to play out? Right? It colors my own view of the Church.
This is a question about our Holy Father meeting with President Obama. I'm intrigued about who sets the agenda for that conference and what might be our hope beyond a symbolic meeting. What might be our hope?
Well, the way they set the agenda for that meeting is it's set from both sides. And inside both of these two voices are really complicated institutions, the Catholic Church and the American government. So the agenda is probably likely being thought out right now because there will only be so many questions that will be dealt with. My guess is that the president for sure will want to talk about inequality and what he says the United States is doing about it, and the Pope will want to talk about inequality for sure. My second thing is the Pope is going to the Middle East on May 1st and 2nd. The American government will be very, very aware that the Pope is going, and they'd be dying to get the right kind of one sentence out of him that says, you know, the peace process ought to continue this way. The Pope will have to consider many other things, to consider his relationship with Israel and the Jewish community, which is very strong in his personal life. But the fact that the Palestinian community is the Christian community for whom he'll say Mass. And so it isn't for him a simple task to say, the peace process is right on track, if the peace process doesn't have support within his own constituency. So I think inequality, the Middle East, religious freedom, you'll both talk about religious freedom in different ways, but that has become an increasingly difficult problem for Catholics in places like the Middle East, sections of Africa, etc. The Central African Republic right now is just a horrendous situation of enormous poverty, religious conflict. And of course, the conflict is Muslim-Christian. Nigeria, repeated Muslim-Christian, what's happening. And so then how do you talk about religious freedom without igniting further conflict? Because this is a pretty high-level meeting, depending on what it said. So my guess is there's 3. There are many others that are possibilities. I sort of bet the farm on those 3 will be present. I don't know what else will be there.
I don't know, can you agree with it? Talking back to your point and the tweets and how everybody's saying when Francis said this. I've lived under, I forget how many reigns, I guess I go back to Pius XI. Only 2 popes have stand out as an individual in my mind, John the 23rd and this pope. And I think what draws universally people to him is he starts off with, I'm a sinner, and this is what we all identify. And he speaks to us like, no. Does that relate to you, or is that the simplicity of the man? And when he says, get out of your churches and get into the ghettos, get into where the action is.
I think, as a New Yorker, my favorite part is that he takes public transportation. Nothing like seeing the Pope on a bus with other people, even when he was a bishop. Right? He can't do that anymore. For me, John Paul II really, obviously, dominated. Like, he was the Pope for the whole time. There was no other Pope in my life until Benedict XVI, who came about when I was, a grown-up. I was pregnant with my first child. So, it was my whole universe for a long time. So he really stands out in my head as someone who was a very public Pope, right? And someone who wanted to do a lot of things. And he was very charismatic. Eventually I wound up disagreeing with his views on a lot of things, but not everything. And I think what's nice about Francis is that he's a person. He just seems like a person, is the best way I can. He doesn't seem like this otherworldly figure. A lot of the work that I do in the contemporary Catholicism class that I teach is when we start to talk about, for example, the sex abuse crisis and why did this happen, and what sort of idea did people have about priests, and what sort of idea did people have about the church? And it was this monophysitism, right, or ecclesial docetism, that the church was not human, that the church was divine, and that the people who were in the church were above sin. But in fact, they're just people. So when the Pope says he's a sinner, that works, right? Then you say, even the Pope, right? I'm not the Pope, doesn't work anymore, right? Because even the Pope says he's a sinner. So I think that's nice.
I recently saw the movie The Son of God. Okay? Excellent. It was not Hollywood, it was print. And in that movie, Mary Magdalene hung out with the 12 apostles throughout the entire movie. I loved that part. She was visible, but she never opened her mouth, but her presence was dynamic. But at the Last Supper, Jesus took a cup and blessed it, not a chalice. And he took it for the salvation of all, not many. And I would like to know whose idea it was to change it to a chalice, and for some, or the many, and not all, And also, there's one other question. Oh, our young people, how about consubstantial? How do you like that one? Whoever's idea it was to change the language, I'm not on board at all.
Well, now. I think consubstantial comes out of the 4th century. So he wasn't really bringing back that. The all and the many, I think, was part of the redoing of the lectionary, of the missal. And I don't know where chalices came from. That's beyond me. Sorry, that's all I can do.
I'm really sad that Mary Magdalene doesn't talk in the movie. She doesn't talk at all? Does Mary Magdalene not speak?
She didn't have to talk.
Oh, no, but she does. She has to talk.
And she was the
But then how did anybody else find out?
She didn't have to say anything.
Yeah.
She was there.
It works. There's lots of information about what we call the liturgical wars, and I'll be happy to send you some documentation. I'm too busy for about 2 years. And I'll do that, Therese. Don't you agree that we owe these two people